It's a Tory win that looks like a loss and a Labour loss that looks like a win.
Security and the response to the ISIL threat have become a central concern.
Theresa May called the selection and she's lost.
But ended up in her own coalition of chaos, a hung parliament.
Theresa May.
In Cuba, the government has long used journalism as a propaganda tool, and for that, until recently, it has been largely unapologetic. Following the revolution in 1959, the role of the news media was envisioned as one of education and garnering mass support for the Cuban political project. The country's film industry, however, has been a different story. Cuban film directors have been able to get away with showing things that journalists simply cannot, sometimes providing pointed critiques on the contradictions in Cuban social reality. On occasion, the films have even taken aim at Cuban news outlets, mocking reporters and the editorial red lines that limit their journalism. While contemporary economic realities have recently forced filmmakers to look abroad for their funding, much of Cuban cinema is funded by the very same state that it criticizes. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now from Havana on the role that film plays in Cuban political debate.
6 reporters from Cuba's state paper, a deadly meteor strike, and an alien invasion in Havana. A satirical short called Brainstorm that casts an acidic eye on journalism in Cuba.
Bueno, compañeros, como comprenderán, dada la gravedad de las circunstancias, tenemos que esperar una orientación superior para emplanar la primera página.
What's the story? What's the angle?
Tenemos nuestra tarea principal, es potenciar los intereses del pueblo.
What do they put on their front page?
Compañeros, ustedes se imaginan lo que hará la prensa extranjera con un titular que hable de 100 muertos en la capital.
Brainstorm takes place at a news outlet. There's this incredible news story, which would make the front page of any other newspaper around the world. The news that the Martians have landed.
We had a pretty good idea of how the US media would react to a meteorite striking and the possibility of extraterrestrial life. We've seen it in their films. But what would the Cuban media do?
No conviene sembrar la inquietud en nuestra población.
Ay, amor, la inquietud no la sembramos nosotros, ¿eh? La sembró el meteorito. Y vaya, si hay más de 100 muertos y nosotros no lo decimos, entonces podrías explicarme qué carajo es el periodismo.
For them, it's a given that whenever something important happens, the decision of what goes on the front page is not theirs, but rather it comes from above. A fictional short like Brainstorm portrays how journalism works, even seen from a satirical standpoint. It still has a lot of resemblance to reality. Sometimes I turn on the national news and the headline is that the farm in the province of Mayabeque met or surpassed its potato production.
Los colectivos azucareros de Mayabé que trabajan por elevar los resultados agroindustriales en
fact, people say that if you want to eat potatoes, just watch the newscast. It's the only place you can actually find it.
Because if there's one place on the planet where news is not all doom and gloom, it's Cuba. The narrative devices, distraction techniques, and visual wallpaper in news bulletins are designed to produce propaganda. And so the reality of food shortages are glossed over with celebrations of harvests. And the challenges of the present are deflected with anniversaries of the past.
60 primaveras han transcurrido sin sombras de olvido.
There's a program on Cuban TV called Cuba Speaks, where the trickiest social issues are supposedly discussed, but it doesn't really manage to go beyond the surface of things. In the official press, the subject of Cuban diaspora isn't touched. Those 2 million Cubans abroad, invisible.
The government has recently called for journalism to become more active, more critical. Cuban television has recently started to deal with thornier social issues. One show called Breaking the Silence deals with gender violence based on real-life events, dealing with very sensitive issues.
But progress has been slow. For the country's news media, even the word change is too sensitive, too loaded with negative connotations. So when they refer to Cuba's political and economic transition, they prefer to use euphemisms. The updating of the Cuban model is a popular one. Cuban film, on the other hand, has been less timid, much bolder in tackling the country's challenges and contradictions. And that's been the case ever since the beginning of the revolution. In 1959, the first cultural policy passed by the Castro regime was Law 169, which laid the foundations for a cinema production not just of creative expression, but of critical endeavor. In effect, cinema was seen as a powerful messaging tool for the revolution, and filmmakers were given a level of autonomy that state news outlets could only wish for. The Cuban film industry pioneered what became known as third cinema, an attempt to free itself from US cultural dominance and to produce a homegrown, more politically engaged, less commercially beholden cinema. The films that were born of this movement challenged creative, narrative, and very often political limits.
Cuban cinema has always tried to reflect and push further on subjects that have not been seen in official media, like TV and print. I think directors like Tomás Gutiérrez Alea have been able to bring nuance to the darkest areas of Cuban reality.
Films such as Death of a Bureaucrat or Memories of Underdevelopment were films that dealt with subjects with a heretic tone as far as Cuban TV or the national press were concerned.
Esta isla es una trampa. Somos muy pequeños, demasiado pobres. Es una dignidad muy cara.
Traditionally, subjects such as state security, Fidel Castro, the representation of national heroes as imperfect, as flawed, cinema has been at the forefront in dealing with these taboos.
If we think about issues covered in Cuban cinema, like education, which is one of the pillars of the Cuban political system, there are films that have managed to go beyond the often repeated line that, in Cuba, education is free and is very good. The film Conducta deals with education as a human story, showing how a teacher from an older generation comes into conflict with the values of a younger generation. Apparently, the filmmakers were worried about the film sparking controversy, but in the end, the Culture Ministry and a lot of teachers liked it, and it generated a good debate at the Ministry of Education.
The issue of sexual identity also fills an important space, a subject where Cuban cinema has led the way.
¿A ti te gustan las mujeres? A mí me gustan los hombres.
The film Strawberries and Chocolate promoted a discussion around these taboos.
Y no impide que yo sea una persona decente ni tan patriota como tú. Sí, pero tú no eres revolucionario. ¿Quién te dijo a ti que yo no soy revolucionario?
I think cinema has provided an alternative means of communication to address certain subjects. Cinema has been able to deal with these issues in a more direct and raw way, in the way that everyday Cubans really experience them.
Cuba's state media outlets like the national paper Gramma, the news agency Prensa Latina and state TV Cuba have never claimed to be anything but mouthpieces for the government. But this film scene might look familiar to the journalists who work there. So far, we haven't been able to reach anyone there for their feedback. We imagine they may be stuck in an editorial meeting.
Oye, la capital alcanzó el primer lugar nacional en emulación portuaria.